As regular viewers will know, Hungary's economy hasn't been in great shape recently. Inflation has hovered stubbornly at around 4% for the past 2 years, and GDP growth has been really weak. This has all been bad news for Hungarian Prime Minister Viktor Orbán, who's seen his main opposition surge in the polls recently. But last week he enjoyed a rare respite when he successfully leveraged a personal relationship with US President Donald Trump to secure a temporary waiver from US sanctions on Russian oil and gas. Furthermore, Orbán also hinted that the US might provide economic aid to Hungary ahead of the upcoming general election in April, like they did in Argentina. So in this video, we're going to take another look at Hungary's troubled economy and whether Trump could really bail Orbán out. We've just released a brand new coffee table book called Assembly Required, which runs through the stories behind some of the world's most beautiful parliament buildings. It's 300 pages long, features hundreds of photos, as well as custom designed floor plans and maps, all alongside the stories of each building written out by our team. Find out more and pick up a copy by clicking the link in the description. Let's start with some context. We've covered this a fair bit in previous videos, but essentially the Hungarian economy has been in a real rut for the past couple of years. Hungary suffered a severe inflationary shock in 2022 and 2023, with year-on-year inflation peaking at 25%, forcing Hungary's central bank to hike interest rates to a 20-year high. This triggered a deep contraction in real wages and a collapse in purchasing power. To placate voters, Orbán has been running huge budget deficits, funding giveaways to key voter groups like tax breaks for the young, pension bonuses for the elderly, and home renovation grants for families. This spending, combined with the fact that the EU has frozen billions of euros of funding over democratic backsliding and rule of law concerns, meant that Hungary ran a pretty massive deficit, representing 4.9% of GDP in 2024, which is expected to grow again this year. To make matters worse, this spending has pushed up inflation, which is hovering at around 4.3%, and hasn't actually helped growth. Hungary has suffered from lower growth rates than its regional peers for the past couple of years, and has essentially flatlined recently. Persistent deficits and weak growth have pushed up borrowing costs, as the market casts doubt on Hungary's ability to pay off its growing debt burden. The yield on Hungary's 10-year bonds, for instance, has been at about 7% for the past year, far above both where it was pre-pandemic and most of its Central European peers. Meanwhile, Orbán has been tightening his grip on civil society, and Hungary now has the worst corruption index rating in the EU. Of course, this has really frustrated ordinary Hungarians, but it also hasn't helped the economy, both because the EU has in turn frozen around 20 billion euros in funding, and because it's undermined investor confidence, which was already on the floor thanks to Orbán's habit of imposing surprise taxes in an attempt to plug the widening deficit. So an unravelling economy, allegations of widespread corruption, and a cost of living crisis have helped to propel a nascent opposition party into a double-digit lead in some polls ahead of Hungary's elections next April. And as a result, they've become the most serious challenge to Orbán's uninterrupted rule since 2010. So with this backdrop, Orbán was hoping to get some political respite and special treatment when Donald Trump returned to the White House at the start of this year. Orbán has long been a close personal and political ally of the president, echoing many of Trump's favourite talking points, especially with regards to immigration and social issues. When the two leaders met last week in the Oval Office, Trump praised Orbán for doing, quote, a fantastic job, and hailed him as a great leader, offering a renewed endorsement ahead of Hungary's upcoming elections. However, an even bigger win for Orbán was the fact that he managed to get Hungary an exemption from the US's sanctions on purchasing Russian oil and gas. For context, since coming into office earlier in the year, Trump has been trying and failing to end the war in Ukraine. So in reaction to Putin's apparent intransigence, Trump has intensified his efforts in recent weeks, and last month, Trump, who has criticised the EU for continuing to buy Russian gas, imposed sanctions on Russia's biggest energy companies, as well as threatening sanctions on their buyers. This came after Trump punished India for allegedly continuing to purchase Russian gas and issued a 50% tariff on Indian goods earlier this year. Of course, this wasn't great news for Orbán either, who continued to import Russian energy and expressed some anxiety last month that Trump's threatened sanctions would ruin the Hungarian economy. After all, stopping all Russian gas would almost definitely push up Hungarian energy prices, as well as boosting inflation yet further. But luckily for Orbán, he managed to bag an exemption from those sanctions. Previously, Trump had been sympathetic to Orbán's argument that landlocked Hungary had no other alternative to Russian energy, and again repeated this claim during their meeting, even though it's a pretty big contradiction from Trump's side, as his administration has told other European countries that they should use the Croatian pipeline, which supplies crude from the Adriatic Sea as an alternative source. Now, how long this exemption lasts is uncertain. Hungarian officials have said it's indefinite, while Trump's team said that it will be time limited to 1 year. Nevertheless, with elections around the corner next April, even if it is only for a year, that's good enough for Orbán. In exchange, Orbán has apparently also agreed to a flurry of US energy investments, including spending $600 million on US liquefied natural gas and around $20 billion on as many as 10 small modular nuclear reactors. Although we've got to say, we have no idea where Orbán thinks he's going to find a spare $20 billion to actually buy those. On top of this exemption, Orbán has also said that Trump agreed to support Hungary's economy if it came under attack from, quote, speculators, and framed this potential US aid as a way to reduce Hungary's economic reliance on the EU. Interestingly, this talk of speculators is exactly the same language that US Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent used in justifying the financial lifeline that the US extended to Argentina ahead of last month's midterms in that country too. While the White House fact sheet made no mention of this agreement, this tentatively suggests that the US might be considering a similar scheme to help Orbán survive the upcoming elections, although it's not clear what form this scheme might take. In Argentina's case, the US was mainly trying to support Argentina's currency, the peso, but Hungary doesn't have the same problem, and Hungary's currency, the forint, has actually been strengthening against the euro for the past year or so, as the likelihood of a pro-European candidate winning the next election increases. Now, the US could instead help Orbán fund some pre-election giveaways, like the recently announced $1.6 billion pension top-up, which would put pressure on Hungary's already strained budget. But this would involve just straight-up loaning money to Hungary, which would look like pretty blatant election interference. Nonetheless, it worked in Argentina, where Milei won despite accusations that he had apparently become an American puppet, and Trump might well be tempted to try the same playbook in Hungary to keep one of his few international allies in power. Although we should say it will have to be a pretty big bailout to overcome Peter Majer's double-digit poll lead, especially considering that he's already bashed the plan on X, accusing Orbán of driving the country into even further debt. By now, you probably heard all about this story online, but depending on where you read about it, you might have heard a completely different side of the story. So how are you supposed to know what's real and what's being fabricated by one side or the other? Well, this week we're lucky enough to be sponsored by Ground News, who are the experts in helping you rethink how you consume media online. Their website and app collects thousands of articles, putting them all in one easy-to-access place to help expose outlets' political bias, how relying their reporting practices are, and who owns them, with all of their information backed by ratings from 3 independent news monitoring organizations. And whenever we're faced with a nuanced story, we just head straight to Ground News to get the breakdown on everything we need to understand it better. For example, if we wanted to learn more about Orbán's supposed financial shield with Trump, we would just need to take a look at Ground News, where we can see that 43 sources are reporting on it, with most of the coverage coming from the right. Of the outlets reporting, though, the left frames it as Orbán-EU tensions, whereas the right frames it as protection against EU funding blackmail. You can see quickly who owns the outlets behind each story, and that context matters. Once you start noticing how independent sources frame things differently than massive conglomerates, it changes how you read the news. We've even used it to filter out corporate-owned media when we want a wider mix of voices or hone in on the highest-rated factual outlets. It's one of the few tools that actually helps you shape your media diet, not the algorithm. You know it's no secret just how much we appreciate Ground News. Having such an incredible tool to help us stay fully informed and aware of political bias is a game changer in today's media landscape. And as such, we partner with them to offer TLDR viewers 40% off their unlimited access Vantage plan. All you have to do is subscribe through the link in the description or go to ground.news/TLDR or even scan the QR code on screen, and you'll be supporting an independent news platform working to make the media landscape more transparent.